The night my husband had his assistant escort me out of our own home, it was -18 degrees outside and I was wearing a silk blouse. Not a coat. Not boots. A silk blouse, because I had dressed nicely that evening. I had actually tried. Because I thought maybe, for once, we could have dinner together without his phone face down on the table between us, like a third person neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Instead, his assistant, a 26-year-old named Bentley who had never once looked me in the eye, handed me a manila envelope, and Mr. Whitmore asked me to give you this. Inside was a check for $175,000 and a single paragraph on law firm letterhead. The paragraph said our marriage was over. It said I had 30 minutes to gather personal belongings. It said the locks would be changed at 9. It was 8:31 p.m. I stood in the foyer of the house I had lived in for 9 years. The house I had picked the floors for, the house where I had painted the nursery twice because the first shade of yellow felt wrong. And I looked at Bentley and I said, "Where is he?" Bentley said, "Mr. Whitmore is unavailable." Mr. Whitmore, my husband, unavailable. I found out later that unavailable meant upstairs in our bedroom with a woman named Celeste, who worked at his firm and who had been, according to the texts I was not supposed to see, the only person who actually understands what I'm building. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. I didn't cry in that foyer, and I didn't cry when I carried one suitcase to my car, and I didn't cry when I drove 40 minutes to my sister's apartment in Kitchener because I had nowhere else to go and my hands were shaking so badly on the highway that I had to pull over twice. I didn't cry because I was trying to do math, $175,000. That was what 9 years was worth to him. That was the number he had landed on. I kept turning it over in my head, trying to understand the logic. Was it a round number he'd thought of himself, or had his lawyers suggested it? Was it meant to seem generous? Insulting? Was it calculated to be just enough that I might take it quietly and disappear? Because here is what my husband did not know. Sitting in our bedroom with Celeste while Bentley handed me that envelope. He did not know who my mother was. He had never asked. In 9 years, he had never asked in any real way. He knew she had died when I was 31. He knew I had flown to Vancouver for the funeral and come back quieter than I left. He knew I called her mum and that she had been a private woman who didn't like attention. He had met her exactly 4 times, and at every dinner she had worn plain clothes and ordered whatever was second cheapest on the menu, and deflected every question about her work with a small smile and a subject change. He had no idea that her name, her full name, the name on the documents she had spent 30 years building, was Sylvia Voss-Hartwell, and he had no idea that Voss-Hartwell Capital was the largest private real estate investment trust in British Columbia, with holdings across 6 provinces and a portfolio that had been valued, at the time of her death, at just over $2 billion. He had no idea that I was the sole beneficiary. He had no idea that I had spent the 14 months since her death in very quiet conversations with very serious lawyers, executing a transfer of assets so orderly and so airtight that by the time Bentley handed me that envelope and told me I had 30 minutes, every single thing my mother had built was already in my name. I drove to my sister's apartment and I sat at her kitchen table and she made me tea, and I told her what had happened and she said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to let him find out. My husband's name is Sterling Whitmore. He is 44 years old, and he is the kind of man who introduces himself with his job title even at dinner parties. He built his company, a mid-size commercial real estate development firm called Whitmore Group, over 12 years, and he was proud of it in the way that people are proud of things they have decided represent them entirely. The company was not just what he did, it was who he was. I had understood that going in. When we married, I was 30 and he was 35. And I was working as a project coordinator at a nonprofit, and he was impressive in the way that men with momentum are impressive. Certain, forward-moving, always 3 steps into the next thing. I thought his ambition would make room for mine. I thought we would build something together. What actually happened was quieter and more erosive than that. My ambitions got smaller, and then they got rescheduled, and then at some point I stopped having a clear answer when people asked me what I was working on. And I think I let that happen because his certainty was easier to live inside than my own uncertainty. I am not going to pretend I didn't know something was wrong before that night. I knew. I had known for probably 2 years. In the specific way you know things you are not ready to act on. The distance, the phone, the way he talked about Celeste with slightly too much detail for someone who was just someone from work. I knew. I just didn't know what to do with the knowing. And so I kept setting the table for dinner and hoping. After that night, I was done hoping. My sister's name is Nell and she is 3 years older than me and the most practical person I have ever met. She did not tell me everything would be okay. She poured the tea and she sat across from me and she said, "Do you have a lawyer?" I did. I had the same lawyer who had managed my mother's estate for 20 years. A woman named Constance, who operated out of a glass tower in downtown Toronto, and who had known me since I was 12 years old. I called her the next morning. She said, "I've been wondering when you'd call." I said, "He served me with a letter and a check for $175,000. There was a pause, then she said very calmly, "What would you like to do?" I said, "I want to make sure he understands exactly what he walked away from." She said, "Give me 72 hours. I want to tell you about those 72 hours because they were not dramatic. That is not how any of this actually felt." I slept on Nell's couch under a blanket that smelled like her dog. I ate toast. I watched 3 episodes of a baking show and did not retain anything about them. I called my therapist, and she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "You don't have to perform this, not the grief and not the anger. Just be in it." So I was in it. It was small and unglamorous, and it hurt in a physical way, the way grief always does, sitting somewhere between the ribs and the stomach. 9 years. The yellow nursery I had painted, and then repainted because the first shade was wrong. The way he used to put his hand on the small of my back at parties. The version of the future I had been holding in my head for so long I had stopped examining whether it was still real. I let myself feel that. All of it. And then I let Constance work. On the 4th day, my husband's lawyer called at 7:14 a.m. I know the exact time because Sterling texted me at 7:21, and it was the first time he had texted me since Bentley handed me that envelope. The text said, "We need to talk." I did not respond. He called at 7:45. I let it go to voicemail. At 8:02 he texted again, "Audrey, pick up. This is serious. I want you to understand something about that second text." He used my name. In 9 years of marriage he had called me Audie, or babe, or, when he was feeling particularly warm, sweetheart, in a tone that made it sound like a concession. He used my full name the same way he used people's full names in business meetings, when he wanted them to understand that the pleasantries were over. I let him call 2 more times. Then I texted back, "You can speak with Constance Fairweather at Fairweather and Associates. You have her number." Here is what Constance had found. Sterling's company, Whitmore Group, had spent the last 3 years over-leveraged. He had taken on 2 large development projects in the Greater Toronto area simultaneously, which had made sense when interest rates were lower, and which had become increasingly precarious as they climbed. He had been managing this by pursuing a refinancing agreement with a capital partner, a firm called Aldous Pacific, which had verbally committed to a $28 million bridge loan that would let him restructure his debt and complete both projects. The commitment letter from Aldous Pacific was contingent on one thing: a satisfactory review of Whitmore Group's existing lender relationships and asset backing. What Constance had found, what she had found because she had spent 30 years in this industry, and because she knew exactly where to look, was that one of Sterling's primary lenders had a silent minority stakeholder. That stakeholder was Voss-Hartwell Capital. My mother had bought a 12% stake in that lending institution 11 years ago, during a portfolio diversification that Sterling had known nothing about because he had never asked my mother a single serious question about her work. When the estate transferred to me, that stake transferred too. It was not a controlling interest. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters. A 12% stake does not give you operational control. What it gives you is a seat at certain tables, and a phone call that gets returned, and the ability to raise a flag that causes people to take a closer look before they sign anything. Constance raised a flag. She did not do anything improper. She simply made sure that the right people were aware that there was an ongoing matrimonial dispute involving the principal of Whitmore Group, and that the resolution of that dispute might have material implications for the company's financial picture. That was true. It was entirely and accurately true. Aldous Pacific paused its commitment letter pending clarification. Sterling's refinancing, which he had been counting on to hold both projects together, was on hold. He called Constance himself 2 days later. I was not on that call. She told me about it afterward, in the precise, neutral way she tells me everything. She said he had started professionally. He said he understood there were some concerns and he wanted to address them, and he was sure they could resolve this quickly and sensibly. He said he hoped this wouldn't need to become adversarial. Constance told him that resolution was certainly possible and that she'd be happy to share what an equitable resolution might look like. Then she sent him our terms. I will not list every item. What I will tell you is that $175,000 was not among them. He called me that evening. This time I answered. He said, "What is this?" I said, "It's what equitable looks like." He said, "Audrey, you can't actually," and then he stopped. I could hear him breathing. He said, "Your mother's company. How long have you?" 14 months, I said. "Since the estate settled. You never told me." I let that sit for a moment, then I said, "You never asked." Another silence. Then, "Celeste has nothing to do with this." "I know," I said, and I meant it, because I was done being angry at Celeste. She was not the architect of the last 9 years, she was not the one who had made me smaller. "This isn't about Celeste. This is about 9 years and what they're worth," he said. "I gave you $175,000, I said. "Yes, you did. I want to tell you about the part that no one warns you about, which is that winning isn't clean." There was no single moment where I stood across from Sterling and watched his face change, and felt the satisfaction I had imagined during those 72 hours on Nell's couch. What actually happened was weeks of back and forth between lawyers and documents, and one very long afternoon in Constance's boardroom, where Sterling sat across the table from me and looked tired in a way I had never seen him look before, and I realized I felt almost nothing about it. Not triumph, not grief, just a kind of exhausted clarity. He had brought his own lawyer, a man I did not know, who spoke mostly in procedural language and who kept using the phrase mutually beneficial resolution. Sterling barely spoke. He looked at the table more than he looked at me. At one point, our eyes met. And I thought he was going to say something real. For a second, I thought he was going to acknowledging the years, the distance, the silk blouse, and the -18 degrees. He looked back at the table. That was fine. I had stopped needing him to say it. Celeste left the firm 4 months later. I heard this from a former colleague of Sterling's who ran into Nell at a farmer's market and thought she was me. "We look alike," Nell and I, and said, very awkwardly, that he was sorry about everything, and that it seemed like Sterling was having a rough stretch. Nell thanked him and called me immediately. I thought about calling Sterling. I didn't. There was a period where I thought about that a lot, what I owed him, if anything. Whether the right thing was to be gracious. I had been raised by a woman who believed in proportion, who believed that the response should fit the situation and not exceed it. My mother had never been cruel. She had also never been a pushover, and she had never confused the two. I think what I landed on was this. I did not destroy his company. His company is still running. The 2 projects were restructured, scaled back, one sold at a loss, one completed with a different financing partner. Whitmore Group is smaller now, and Sterling is not building the way he used to build, but he is not bankrupt. He has what he made, he just doesn't have me. And I didn't get $175,000. The thing about inheriting something large is that it takes a long time to understand what it actually means. My mother built Voss-Hartwell Capital across 3 decades, which is longer than I have been an adult. She did it without drawing attention to herself, without putting her name on buildings, without the kind of visibility that Sterling always associated with success. She had offices in Vancouver and Calgary, and a small team of people who had worked with her for years, and who, when I flew out to meet them for the first time after the estate settled, were kind to me in a way that made me realize they had known about me long before I had known about any of this. One of them, her head of operations, a quiet man named Hargreave, who had been with my mother for 17 years, said to me, "On that first trip, she talked about you often. She was very proud of that," I said. "She never told me any of this," he said. "I think she wanted you to figure out who you were without the weight of it first." I have thought about that a lot. I still don't know if she was right to do it that way. But I have stopped being angry at her for it, which took longer than I expected. I am 39 now. I live in a condo in Toronto that I own outright, which I chose because it had south-facing windows and a balcony just big enough for 2 chairs, and because the building has a dog policy, and I have a dog now. A medium-sized brown mutt named Biscuit, who is unreasonably confident and has opinions about which route we take on our morning walk. I run Voss-Hartwell Capital. I did not step into that role immediately. I spent about 8 months learning it from the inside, talking to Hargreave and the team, and to Constance, and to financial advisors I trusted before I trusted my own judgment. I still talk to all of them. My mother was good at surrounding herself with people who knew things she didn't, and I am trying to be good at that too. I do not define myself by what happened with Sterling. I want to be honest about that, without making it sound simpler than it was. It shaped me, the way anything that costs you something shapes you. But it is not the most interesting thing about me, and it is not the first thing I think about when I wake up in the morning. The first thing I think about in the morning is usually Biscuit, who sits beside the bed and breathes loudly until I acknowledge him. I told this story because I think there is a version of it that gets told a lot. The version where a woman is discarded and then revealed to be secretly powerful. And the reveal is the point. The revenge is the catharsis. And everything that comes after is a neat resolution. That is not quite how it felt from inside it. What I remember most from those first weeks is not the moment Sterling found out, or the look on his lawyer's face in the boardroom, or any of the things that might read as satisfying. What I remember is sitting in Nell's kitchen at 11 p.m., drinking tea that had gone cold, and realizing that I had spent 9 years making myself smaller inside a life that was mostly his, and that I had a choice now about who I was going to be inside my own. That is the part that required the most from me. Not the legal process, not even the grief. The slow, unglamorous work of deciding what I actually wanted, and believing I was allowed to want it. My mother built something extraordinary, and then stepped back and let me not know about it until I was ready. Maybe she understood something I didn't, about what it takes to come into your own power. That you can't inherit the confidence along with the assets, that you have to grow it yourself, that arriving at it through difficulty means it actually belongs to you in a way it wouldn't have if it had just been handed over. I'm not sure she was right. But I'm not sure she was wrong either. What I know is this. I have a south-facing window and a dog with opinions and a company my mother spent 30 years building. I know what my name is worth now, not because of what she left me, but because of what I chose to do with it. And I know that $175,000 in the end cost my husband considerably more than he had planned.